So thanks, Paul. My name is Michael Forbes. I'm the manager of the refurbishment engineering at Renewable Parts. I've been here for around 3 years, but the business is almost 10 years old. The business started out with the name Recycled Renewables in Lochilphead, but moved after that to Renfrew for logistics reasons. The refurbishment centre was opened around about 3 years ago when I joined, in order to start repairing and recirculating parts in the wind industry. So you could say that it's gone full circle. When it started, it was possibly slightly ahead of its time, looking at parts. So I'm going to talk about refurbishment and how this has helped create a circular economy in the wind industry. So the first question really would be, why would somebody want to buy a refurbished product? And to begin with, we very much found that the customer's incentive was on price and lead time. The refurbished parts are generally considerably cheaper than new. Also, for the most part, we try and hold refurbished stock on the shelves, where in the industry, the new part, the new equivalent, can have a massive lead time, up to 26 weeks. So to begin with, we found that the customers were approaching us, or the discussions were all based around price and lead time. We've certainly found recently that a lot of the customers are starting to focus more on their green credentials and cutting waste, and the discussions are starting to take a turn in that direction. We supply almost all of the large utilities companies and service companies in the UK. And we found one or two in particular have really embraced circular economy and are approaching us now. And the first question is, can this be refurbished rather than would it be refurbished? The other point is that it would generally be expected that a refurbished item would perform as well as new. But in addition to that, we're striving to ensure our refurbished products will perform at least as good as new, but maybe other factors at play, even if it's down to packaging or how the part is presented, to make it easier at site to unpack, or easier to fit, or even a design improvement. This is ongoing all the time. Our R&D department is working at improvement. So I would imagine, if you're attending this event, that you're familiar with the circular economy and the various diagrams that you see at most of these type of events. Certainly the one on the screen here is one that I've seen a number of times. I think the important thing to point out with this diagram is that while recycling is undoubtedly a good thing, no one would deny that recycling is a good thing, but in this context, recycling should be seen as the second worst option after landfill. What you really want to do is keep that loop as small as possible. So obviously, as far as carbon footprint is concerned, the most economic means of keeping the turbine working is to repair the part on site. Obviously, if that's not possible, it's going to have to come out the turbine, possibly be sent for repair, remanufacture. At the moment, we are at the refurbishment stage, sort of on the line between refurbishment and remanufacture. Parts are beyond repair or beyond refurbishment, are generally broken parts for parts harvesting, so aren't necessarily recycled. For some, the transition to a circular economy can be gradual, but there's, I don't think, any excuse for the renewable sector. It's been coming for a long time. Everyone's aware of it, and I think a lot of businesses are starting to embrace it now. So looking at creating a circular economy specifically in the wind industry and how we've set about doing that, the way our process works is that we stock refurbished parts. So we've built feedstock of parts. We feel there's a decent volume going through and enough value. We stock these parts, we sell it as a refurbished part, and a condition of sale is that an old part is returned. So we don't put a value on the part being returned, we simply put on the invoice that an old part is returned as a condition of the sale. So this is something that a few of the customers have taken a while to come round to. You know, we still occasionally get a customer coming to us and saying, "Can you repair this part?" But the idea or the way it works is that you don't necessarily get the same part back. You're likely to get a different part, different serial number, and you're supplying the old part back to us, which we can then refurbish according to our own work schedule and put that back into stock. We see this as the only way of having a scalable system. I think if we were still looking at repair or refurbishing parts to go back to the same customers, it'd be very difficult to scale up. We do take the risk in this case where we're selling the refurbished part at a set price regardless of the condition of the return unit. So obviously there's risk there because the cost to us for the refurb can fluctuate wildly with the set sale price. Again, without doing it in this way, it would be very, very difficult to scale up. And I think the key enabler for circular economy in almost all areas is the reverse logistics. It's certainly been the big challenge for us over the last year in particular, now that we're starting to see a lot more volume of parts. The reverse logistics can be particularly tricky. The person you're dealing with in selling the refurbished part is very unlikely the person who's having to package up and return the old part. So we'll be dealing with a procurement department in selling the refurbished part, but we may be dealing with a site technician or an engineer, or possibly a warehouse member of staff who is then responsible for returning the old parts. This is obviously a job that this person didn't have to do a year ago. It's for the most part, the stuff coming back to us is stuff that would have been disposed of a year ago. So we possibly been putting just waste uplifts arranged. And now we're asking for these parts to be returned to us. So in order to make that as simple as possible, we have presentations that we do to our customers. We ask our customers to nominate a person to be our point of contact. This doesn't necessarily need to be an onerous task. It can just be a case of keeping in touch once a month with the parts that are going back and forward, and then making sure that the parts are being packaged. The main breakthrough really was the packaging. That we've designed and made packaging for a number of the parts, which the parts are sold in, but the same packaging is then used for the returns. Makes it as easy as possible. It makes it less likely that the parts damaged in transit, or possibly when unpacking use. So it's been a real breakthrough for us. The site technicians and engineers at the sites have all commented, and this has really been the difference between the programme working and not. The refurbishment process itself, and this is where I've had a lot of help from SIR and various other partners. The refurbishment process really relies a lot on traceability. We serialise every single part that comes to us, so we can then trace that part through the process, but also track it when it's sold. Also, in doing that, we can note any defect from the part coming in. So it might be that the technician has written that site, the turbine number, what had failed or what they thought had failed. This all goes onto our system. If in the future we were to get a warranty claim for one of our refurbished parts, we can trace it right back and see which customer that came from in the first place and what the problem had been. Possibly start to spot failure trends and areas where improvements could possibly be made. All our processes follow an in-house work instruction. When we get a part for the first time, we would assess the feasibility of refurbishment. That doesn't necessarily mean because it can be refurbished that it will be, because the cost of refurbishment is close to the cost of new or possibly more. So we have, first of all, a technical assessment, but also a business assessment, and put a case together to see whether the refurbishment is feasible. At that point, we're also looking at what we think could go wrong. So it might be that the part we've got in to have a look at might be a particularly good example of that part. So we could price on that basis, and then the next 10 parts would be in a worse condition. So there's a lot of consideration goes into starting a new refurbishment programme per part. There's a lot of research also goes into the refurbishment process and how we can have a pass off that we are satisfied with and provide a warranty that matches that of new. This is where we really do rely on partners, academic partners, because this is the type of research that a business our size couldn't do in-house. So the pictures you see on the screen here are a particular planetary carrier from a gearbox, a recurring failure. It's actually a design fault in the type of turbine. But the pictures you see here, the first two pictures were by the AMRL at the University of Strathclyde, looking at the condition of the new parts, and the other picture you see there was the Department of Manufacturing, Engineering and Management doing some RCA on that same part. Capability, we do have a fairly small workshop in Lochilphead. We have a small team, around about 6 employees who are doing all the refurbishment in-house at the moment. We have a number of partners that we sub to for external refurb. Again, these are approved partners we work closely with them. Maybe that they specialise in a specific type of part and the testing capability that we just couldn't have in-house. So parts-wise, it's a combination of in-house and contracted work. We work very closely with each subcontractor. We're very happy with the work. We don't expect to see any issues. Our own workshop, we outgrew within the first 3 or 4 months of moving in, so we have a purpose-built workshop, which in January, and hope to be operating from there by February, which is roughly 5 times the size of the place we are, and we're expecting to take on another 2 or 3 people. Capability-wise, we also have a range of components, and also for a range of different turbine types. I think we never ever knock back a part because we don't feel that there's going to be volume. It may be that it's a part that's a real headache for a customer. So doing that part might be in the door for refurbishment that customer in other areas. As I say, the partnerships are very important to us. It's not just partnerships with academic institutions. We have a close relationship with Scottish Remanufacture. I think Paul's possibly sick of the sight of us. We've got a good relationship with Zero Waste Scotland, both in terms of drawing down funding, but also a number of other support in other areas. A lot of support from Ions and Ions Enterprise, and the business started in Lochilphead. We fall within their area for support, and we've had various different support through HIE. But also the partnerships, should be pointed out, are with our suppliers and, just as importantly, our customers. So we have customers who are keen to engage, and the outcome they're looking for is a refurbishment solution. So where there are areas that they have problems, they see us as possibly a safety net to check whether a part can be recirculated before they decide to send that for waste. My final slide is just on leading by example, so to speak. I think if we are promoting a circular economy in the wind industry and promoting, an awareness of green policy, then I think we have to do that in-house as well. We won the Vibe Circular Scotland Award last year, also recently, just last week, we're the recipient of the Carbon Reduction Award at the Green Energy Awards, which we're really pleased with. We have a culture through the business of cutting waste and have an awareness of our credentials. A few of us in the refurbishment centre have carried out Green Champions training, but also in our main warehouse in Renfrew. Similarly, our staff there have done that, so it's not just in the refurbishment centre, but company overall. And also I work as an ambassador for Circular Glasgow. We were involved in a number of events through the year. So I think overall we are seeing a real upturn, especially within the last year, of our customers who are really starting to have a real awareness of their image. I think customers are starting to hold utilities companies to account, and their own supply chains, and spotlight's very much on that. So as a result, a lot of people start to look at their own supply chains and how green those supply chains things are. So that's about me. So I think we're ready to hand over to Jamie. If that's all right, I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Michael. That's really good, and it's really been good to see you go from strength to strength, as well as an organisation, and also the level of engagement you're getting across from both the operators and now the OEMs. Maybe a question for later. Jamie, do you want to share your presentation, sir?
Sure, thanks, Paul.
Do you want to just, sorry, stick it in presentation mode? My apologies. We've seen your notes. There you are.
Is that better?
That's it. Perfect. Perfect.
Great. Thanks for the introduction, Paul. And yeah, thanks very much to the Scottish Institute of Remanufacturing for the invitation to speak today. So my name is Jamie Stewart. I'm the Deputy Director at the Centre for Energy Policy. We're based at the University of Strathclyde, and today I'll be talking about how we ensure prosperity in the race to net zero, really focusing on one of the key challenges, which is industrial decarbonisation. So a quick note on who the Centre for Energy Policy is or are. So we're a multidisciplinary research, knowledge exchange and policy engagement hub, as I said, based at the University of Strathclyde. And really we look at energy and climate issues and try to set them and relate them to the wider public policy context. And it's one thing I'll say quite a few times today, that we really think it's crucial to understand the economic, social and political context and consequences of different net zero actions and policies that the government are setting out to meet that net zero target. And our expertise really lies in macroeconomic modelling, which again allows us to understand some of the consequences to the wider economy of those different policy options. And a lot of our work is set in the context or framed in the context of the need and commitment to deliver a just transition. So this is something that's actually written into the Paris Agreement, and something which the Scottish Government in particular have made a real commitment to. They have set up something called the Just Transition Commission, which our director, Karen Turn, is actually one of the commissioners. And this is really about ensuring that there's prosperity for people in the transition to net zero. It's now kind of widely accepted that that transition is one of the biggest societal challenges that we face, and protecting people's sort of livelihoods and making sure that the transition protects all people and is sort of delivered in an equitable way is one of the real priorities. But beyond that sort of equitable element of the transition, I think it's also important to recognise that that we sort of protect and sustain a strong economy that provides opportunities for people in terms of jobs, and also ensures that people are paying taxes and contributing to a sustainable economy. I just wanted to mention, obviously the last year has been incredibly challenging in terms of the impacts we've seen on health and sort of tragic circumstances. And I think it's what's happened in terms of economic impact has really put in context how important it is to deliver that just transition. So although we've seen some sort of short-term positive impacts on the environment and the climate, you can see there that the titles which came out earlier in the summer about the fact that there's been about a 17% drop in global emissions. So while there are some positive messages for the climate, I think we've all recognised the devastating impact it's had on people's jobs and livelihoods. So I think it reiterates that message about ensuring people have jobs and livelihoods in that transition. So one of the, I guess, most challenging parts of transitioning to net zero is looking at industrial decarbonisation. And by that, I really mean increasing the sustainability and reducing emissions within heavy industry. So that's really what the focus of my talk is going to be on today. And at the moment, it's clear, there's clear messages coming from the UK government about the need to reduce emissions from industry. And I think the wording in this this statement I've taken from the Business, Energy and Clean Growth Minister kind of highlights the scale of the challenge. So he says that we need to eliminate emissions from industry. And I think that's, yeah, his choice of words there. He's talking about eliminating rather than reduce. So it's a really big challenge. But he also points out that reducing those emissions doesn't need to mean that we compromise business success. So the government certainly at the moment are really driving this clean growth agenda, and they want industry to be equipped with the latest low emission technologies so that we can reduce emissions while keeping the economic contribution of those sectors. And I guess the optimistic view is that we create new jobs and new well-paid jobs at that. So that's the vision and the optimism, I would guess, from government, but I think we need to talk about the sort of scale of the challenge. So currently, industrial emissions amount to around 1/4 of all emissions in the UK. They have come down fairly substantially in the last sort of 2 decades. So from 1990 to 2019, we did see a 52% reduction in emissions from the industrial sector. But that is largely due to the fact that we've closed down a lot of industry in the UK. So with things like steel, which I'll talk about a little bit later on, we now import huge amounts of steel from China and other places. So that is responsible for some of the reductions that we've seen. The pie chart at the bottom gives a breakdown of the main kind of contributing sectors to those industrial emissions. So you'll see at the top, we have refineries, followed by chemicals, construction, iron and steel, and cement. And yeah, I think it's fair to say that they are all seen as kind of essential products to our society. So that is one of the key challenges going forward. So while we can do as much sort of reuse and recycling as we can, these products will kind of remain critical parts of our economy. And the CCC in their net zero report kind of again highlight the scale of that challenge. So they're talking about by 2050 eliminating the emissions from the industrial sector. So again, that's going to be hugely challenging. I guess the good news and the positive side of that is that we do have options to help reduce emissions from these industrial processes. And these have been established, I would say, for quite a few years. But the R&D and the technology sector behind these decarbonisation options is really improving, I would say, and we're having, we've got a much better understanding of how we might do that. So I've highlighted 4 of the options here. So one might be fuel switching. So in a process at the moment that uses natural gas for heat, there could be an option to switch that to a low carbon hydrogen. The other option, which I'll talk through in a wee bit more detail, is carbon capture and storage. So this would be bolting on carbon capture equipment to a current industrial process and storing the emissions permanently in the geological subsurface. There's then an option for some processes to electrify the process. And then a fourth option is obviously looking at efficiency gains and innovation to reduce the emissions associated with those industrial processes. So while those options exist, the key question which I'll really be addressing today is how we pay for this and how we ensure that those sectors can be supported to decarbonise while protecting the economic contribution that they present, I guess. So the first example I'll look at is the Scottish chemical sector. And we've used our macroeconomic modelling to look at both the impacts on the sector from applying carbon capture and storage, but also to look at the impact that might have on the wider economy as well. So just to set a little bit of context, the Scottish chemical sector currently employs 6,000 people in Scotland. And that's direct jobs. There's obviously a lot of associated supply chain jobs as well. And as I said, carbon capture and storage could be a solution to allow that sector to continue production while facilitating deep emission reduction at site. I've also noted just in those lower bullet points some of the key assumptions that we've made around our modelling in that area. So carbon capture and storage will change and increase the equipment required to produce the same output. So this is one of the key kind of challenges, that it's going to cost more to produce the same product. And I think if we're talking about those companies remaining kind of commercial, we have to be realistic that they will, be required to continue to give some contribution to their investors and shareholders. So this might mean that the price of their output or their product increases. And if they're selling into a competitive market, there is a risk that cost increase causes their export to reduce. This obviously will have impacts on Scottish jobs, on income generation, and on the tax base, which will ripple upstream through supply chains, through different labour and capital markets. And I think the key point is that while we see the demand for those products remain level, it's likely that production will be met by other producers in other locations. So in effect, we would be offshoring emissions, investment, GDP, and jobs. So that's the kind of assumptions. On the next slide, I've set out the two different scenarios for running BAU, so running chemical sector kind of as they are at the moment. And then on the right-hand side, we've looked at some of the implications of applying carbon capture. So yeah, you'll see on the left-hand side, if that sector doesn't make moves to reduce their emissions, there is a risk that operating in the UK, where there are tighter emission reduction controls, might put the whole business at risk. And I think we've seen that certainly through time in places like Grangemouth. So that could put 6,000 jobs at risk and potentially put the whole GDP contribution from that sector at risk as well. The second option on the right-hand side, where we've looked at applying carbon capture, and we're assuming that the company takes on the cost of applying that equipment. We've assumed, I think it was probably a pessimistic 50% reduction in capital efficiency. And as I said, that will lead to reduced output, reduced export, and reduced sales. And that will then have an ongoing impact on the industry, which could lead to 600 direct industry jobs being lost, or potentially 750 jobs lost in the associated supply chains. And this could have a fairly big impact on the GDP contribution from that sector, so somewhere between 175 to 200 million, and that's a contraction of 0.18%, sorry, 0.18% per annum. So that's yeah, a fairly big impact, I would say, on that sector. Now, what's also been considered is, rather than looking purely at a polluter pays option, whether some public support could be used to support these companies to transition to more sustainable production. And this is something that's being kind of put forward by both the UK government and by the likes of the Committee on Climate Change. So they recognise the challenge for these businesses, and yeah, I guess they would like to see sectors continue to support GDP and jobs while decarbonising. And I guess the challenge is making sure that they can make it through the transition. So the third option we looked at, I put it up on the right hand side here, is if the taxpayer effectively subsidises the competitiveness loss we've modelled in the other scenarios. And what we can see is obviously the 6,000 direct jobs in the chemical sector are retained and protected. But because we've had to raise income tax to pay for that subsidy, we see some other negative consequences. So because income tax is raised, generally households will have less money to spend in the wider economy. So again, we will see a GDP contraction. And we might also see actually greater job losses in sectors that rely on that kind of wider spending in the economy. And the key message really is that there isn't an easy option to this. When we're looking at the transition to net zero, there is undoubtedly costs, and really it will be a challenge for government to decide on those trade-offs and deciding the most kind of equitable and fair way to make sure that we do meet those net zero targets. The other thing that's worth considering is whether there's an additional part of the carbon capture and storage supply chain that could potentially help pay the bills and offset some of the cost of public financial support. So another thing we've looked at is whether a CO2 management industry that transports and stores carbon dioxide in the subsurface of the North Sea could be used, as I said, to pay the bills for subsidising industry. And this might have multiple benefits. So in the UK, we're lucky to have lots of storage capacity in the geological subsurface to store CO2. A lot of other European countries don't have that capacity, so there's potential for the UK and Scotland to actually import CO2 from other nations and be paid to store that CO2. And that could create a new sector which effectively could contribute to the public purse. Another advantage is it could reuse some of the sort of skills and expertise we see in the oil and gas sector, along with reusing existing offshore assets and infrastructure. So it really it could be a win-win, and it could be a really important part of helping to deliver a just transition. So again, I've raised lots of questions. I don't think there's an easy answer to solve all of this, but these are certainly opportunities that could be used over the next decades to help balance the books and make sure we meet our climate targets. The other example I'll quickly run through is the Welsh steel sector. So you've probably seen in the news recently that the sector is, I would say, currently at risk. They're struggling with rising costs in their production, struggling with the risks of Brexit. So the sector has really become the focus of what we do with heavy industry in the UK. And I feel like the industry there is at a tipping point where either we need big reinvestment to make sure that we have a sector that can align with our kind of net zero ambitions and potentially to produce low carbon steel. I think that if we don't reinvest, there's a risk that those sites will close. And again, once they've closed, it's very hard to re-establish that economic contribution again. So again, just to kind of summarise the context of steelmaking in Wales. So the sector currently employs 8,000 people directly, and there's around 2,000 people employed in associated kind of production jobs, things like metal casting. And again, I won't run through all of these in detail, but it's clear that the steel sector in Wales has a huge economic contribution. So for every one full-time equivalent job in the iron and steel production sector, there are 1.8 jobs in the wider, supported in the wider Welsh economy. And again, the steel sector in Wales is responsible for a huge amount of Welsh exports. So we're looking at £4 billion pounds of exports, which is around a quarter of total exports from Wales. So that economic contribution is really clear. But again, one of the key challenges is that the Welsh steel sector is one of the biggest emitters, both in Wales and in the UK. So at the moment, the Port Talbot site, which is one of the biggest steel sites in Wales, emits 6 million tonnes of CO2 per annum. So that's a really big CO2 emissions. And again, the challenge is how do we make that sector more sustainable, reducing emissions while allowing it to continue to produce products. And I think that's really important for the UK when our steel consumption, is still high, and especially if we're looking to develop things like the electric vehicle sector and the renewable sector that might rely on steel. It's really important that we get that balance and don't just rely on steel that's imported from other countries that potentially have lower emission regulations. So the two options for decarbonising steel, the first one is called electric arc. So this is secondary steel production. So it relies on a source of recycled steel. While that is definitely a positive in terms of the circular economy, the output of that steel production isn't as high grade as what we see from primary production. So the second option for decarbonising would be to apply carbon capture and storage to the primary production process, or to switch out the fuel source to hydrogen, and obviously that would rely on having a low carbon source of hydrogen. And I've sort of highlighted in this table here some of the sort of positives and negatives of each of the options. And what we see is that applying carbon capture and storage or hydrogen to that primary production is probably what's best in terms of continuing the output from the steel sector, in terms of employment, and also in terms of reducing those carbon emissions. So again, the options are there, which I think is very positive. One of the key challenges though is who pays for this, and how do we support those sectors to take on those technologies and take on the risk of maybe being one of the first sectors in the world and countries in the world to take on that challenge of producing steel in a more sustainable way. So unfortunately at the moment, I don't think we have any questions about how those industries can be supported. At the moment, I think we're more at the stage of really asking some key questions. So I've highlighted 5 key questions here. So I think one of the key questions is how quickly do new markets for green steel develop? And really interestingly this week, the Steel Zero initiative was launched, which is an initiative that drives companies to agree to procure net zero or low carbon steel by 2050. So in that way, markets could evolve for green steel, and I think that could be really positive. I think one of the key questions is whether companies need just policy and regulatory support, or whether they need financial support to take on the new equipment. And again, one of the point 3 there, how to create a global level playing field. I think this is a key challenge when, at the moment, only the producers of steel are penalised for the emissions, not the people who import it and use the steel. And I think that's one of the key challenges which the EU is actually looking to address through the carbon border adjustment. So that could change things fairly quickly if that's taken on. I think there's also questions around what green steel actually is and how we maybe certify that, and also how we incorporate other UN Sustainable Development Goals to make sure that we're not just producing low carbon steel, but to make sure we're, including things like workers' rights and decent employment conditions and aspects of the circular economy into that steel production as well. So again, I'm not presenting any answers, but I think there's a number of factors that could change the sector fairly quickly, but I think it will be challenging. So my final slide, I'll just leave these up. So at the Centre, we've developed a number of key principles for net zero policymaking. We think it's crucial to understand who really pays, how and when, and understanding what gains could be used to balance this is really fundamental. We need to find pathways that allow us to sustain and grow our prosperity in an equitable way. And finding options and pathways that can deliver near-term economic returns is really crucial. We believe that offshoring is not the answer if it only shifts emissions, jobs and GDP overseas. And as I said at the start, we think that net zero is a societal and public policy challenge more than it is a technological one. So we think the technology exists. The key challenge is finding mechanisms to make sure that we can pay for it in an equitable way. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thanks, James. That's a really good thought-provoking presentation there to even make the associated kind of job losses and the impact of support infrastructure. I think we were quite aware of that from the what happened in Aberdeen with the oil and gas and support infrastructure. Again, we're seeing the same with the current global challenge, but also there's patterns to be recognised and transferred to net zero ambition of offshoring is not the answer. Okay, so we'll move to the Q&A portion of this. So please, parties, take the time to open up the chat and pose your questions and comments. I guess as facilitator, I've got the pleasure of asking the first few questions. The first one to Michael. I've always got a question for you, sir. But I also think it's always quite good to hear more about the journey that you went through with your clients, because I think it was quite interesting of how you originally thought your initial clients were how it might have changed over time and how it is now? I mean, how's that been for our RPL?
Well, certainly the clients, with a number of them being big utilities companies, sometimes there's such a big organisation that you spend a lot of time working out who the best person is to speak within the organisation. You might have an environmental department that have got their own targets and their own areas that they're wanting to focus on, and a procurement department that doesn't have any contact with them at all. So we could be pitching all sorts of stuff to the procurement department somewhere else within that organisation. It's somebody who's crying out for what we're offering. And I think over time we've kind of developed relationships with the key people within some of these organisations. I think one good example is one of our customers in particular, who 2 years ago, somebody within the environmental department's remit had changed from making sure the company bought 10% refurbished goods, and that went up 50% in a year. So all of a sudden the conversations about pricing and lead time and all these things took a back seat, and the conversations were all on, can this be refurbished? There was no question of what the new equivalent costs, or cut and waste, which was really good. It was really good to see, but it takes time. A lot of these big businesses to find the right people.
What was the key change there? Was it kind of being able to demonstrate that the components that you had remanufactured, you had a means of certifying the remanufacturing mechanism that you applied, so they had confidence in the product, or was it just an education piece of educating them so they understood?
No, I think that's a big factor, especially the bigger businesses that quite tight quality procedures and departments. I think having a decent pass off inspection and testing procedure is really important for us to back up our warranty. And I think over time, the likes of the work we've done through SIR with the FRC and AMRL have been, really key in that, because the paperwork that comes off the back of these projects is what we use to back up our warranty and support the product.
Brilliant, thanks. Jamie, for yourself, I'm always interested in kind of sector data in terms of the decarbonisation challenge. For yourselves, where do you predominantly see the work coming from? Is it more from interest points from, say, government or regulators asking the question, or are we beginning to see a bit of a movement across the supply chain to challenge, right, what does our greenhouse gas emissions look like? What do we need to do to decarbonise and prevent this move of offshoring, because the way in which we, as the UK, measure our greenhouse gas emissions, I guess?
Yeah, I think certainly across the supply chains, and certainly some of the bigger companies that operate in the UK in the kind of industrial space, we see that they are making commitments to meet those net zero targets, and I guess that's through a kind of combination of factors or reasons why they're doing that. I think one is when they see kind of direction and support from government. So I think that the high level targets help, I think, but we're now at a stage where they want to see kind of the more specifics of the policies that might help them transition. I think there's also a big drive from some of the international companies that shareholders are looking for them to make commitments. And in that way, whether it's shareholders or people within the supply chain. So for example, Ørsted, the wind company, have made a commitment to start procuring things like low carbon steel. So again, that could then drive some of the steel producers to make low carbon products. So it's all about building confidence that those markets will exist. And I think some of that is driven by government, and some of that is driven by consumer demands, potentially demands from the public. So I think it's really a combination of the different factors.
And in some of your kind of research, have you seen maybe a region or a country that have kind of made necessary movements to encourage more adoption of remanufacturing or circular practices or decarbonised practices?
I think certainly in terms of decarbonisation, the UK is leading the way, I would say. So we were the first G7 country to actually legislate for net zero by 2050 in the UK and 2045 in Scotland. So I think that's, yeah, we are definitely taking the lead in that respect. I would reiterate though that setting those targets for 2-3 decades away is kind of the easy part, and now delivering on that and understanding how we do balance it with the challenge of taking on additional costs, with creating and sustaining our economy. I don't think necessarily we need to talk about economic growth, but just sustaining what we have, I think, will be a challenge. So I think the UK is certainly leading the way, but no one is really yet to take that step forward to address some of these really difficult challenges. So I think, yeah, addressing how we align in like heavy industry is a key challenge. How we reduce the amount of natural gas that the majority of us are using to heat our homes, that would be another key challenge. So I feel like we've kind of done the easy part, and figuring our way through the next decade or so will be the challenging part.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Michael, another question for yourself. So, and it's from the audience. What are the major challenges for expanding your business over the next 5 years?
I think probably the one that jumped out is management of growth. We're putting plans in place right now. We've got a board that's very supportive, and the refurbishment centre the last 2 years in a row has doubled in revenue, and the plans for the next 2 years are double again. A lot of the parts we've been looking at and doing our R&D with are offshore wind turbine components, and we're expecting to see a huge ramp up in volume in those. So what we've been doing is with one eye on growth. We've been building building materials and work instructions for parts that we think are going to see volume in about a year's time. I think the other next logical step for any business our size is starting to look at export and business overseas, and we do have an overseas business manager for the overall business who sells new parts. The big restriction for us with refurbishment is the reverse logistics. We have had inquiries now from various countries in Europe and from Japan on refurbished goods, but at the moment we're kind of ruling that out because it's kind of not really, possibly from a business point of view it's good business, but from an environmental point of view, send 2 tons of parts to Japan and back is out of the question. So I think on scaling up, I think our next plan for moving overseas would really have to look at refurbishment centres in other countries, because the circular economy only really works to keep it very local. Otherwise, you're kind of defeating the purpose.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. That's good. Another one from for yourself, Jamie, from the audience. Do you think that net zero time targets are achievable at the current pace, or achievable generally?
So it's a really good question. I think I would say that the 2045 and 2050 targets are achievable, but obviously present huge challenges. In Scotland, I think one of the biggest challenges is the 2030 target that's been committed to. And I know that was kind of pushed forward by the Scottish Greens. So I think it's a 75% reduction by 2030. And the Scottish Government committed to that. I think from a political perspective, they kind of had to. But it's presented a huge challenge. And I think the policy teams have been frantically scratching their heads in figuring out how we actually deliver that. I think that is a big challenge, especially, as I said, with things like heat. So I think the 2050 targets are achievable, and we've seen big commitments from other countries around the world. So China have committed to a 2060 net zero target now, which I think is great. So I feel like the 2050 targets are achievable. The shorter term interim targets will be more difficult, but that is the reality of setting these targets. And policymakers will have to figure out how we get there and how we get there quickly. And as I said, there will be trade-offs. So some sectors, will be hit, I think. So it's about managing that transition and making sure that we can do it in a way that has the kind of least negative impacts, and make the most out of new sectors that are emerging, like the kind of circular economy, remanufacturing. I think they are sectors where it would be great to see growth, to maybe offset some of the sectors that are seeing decline.
Thank you. That's brilliant. Okay, just looking at the chat, so there's no other questions that have come in, and we're pretty much just before time. So all that's left is just thank you very much, Michael and Jamie, for taking the time today. Two very good presentations. For the participants, if you'd like to get in contact with these guys, please drop us an email. We'll do introductions. The presentations will be uploaded by next week onto the Scottish Institute for Remanufacturing website. So if you'd like to revisit, then that's doable as well. And thank you all for partaking in this week's kind of webinar series, A Voice of Industry. That's been brilliant. Thank you very much, and have a good week all.
Thank you.
Sarah.